The 44th floor conference room had a wall of glass that looked straight down the runway of the private airfield we managed contracts for. I'd sat in that room for 9 years and never once watched a jet lift off. That morning I did, because I had nothing else to do. My badge had already been deactivated, my access revoked in a single line of code, and the memo announcing my transition had gone out before I'd finished my coffee. Anton Marchetti never asked me a single question before he signed it. That was his first mistake. My name, Ingrid Halloran, wasn't just on my office door. It was on something he'd never bothered to read. And by Thursday, a $1.4 billion contract would be sitting in a legal void that only I could fill. I never thought a printer jam would be the thing that told me my career was over. But that Tuesday morning, standing at the shared executive floor printer on the 44th floor of Etherline Aerodyne's headquarters, waiting for a program review packet that would not come, I watched a junior coordinator I'd never met walk past me carrying a box of my things. My nameplate was on top. She didn't make eye contact. She just kept walking toward the elevator bank, and I understood, in the flat fluorescent light of that hallway, that the decision had already been made somewhere above me and was only now trickling down to reach me last. My name is Ingrid Halloran. For 17 years, I ran program integration at Etherline, which is a polite corporate way of saying I was the person who made sure that the hundreds of moving pieces inside a defense aerospace contract actually fit together. The engineering milestones, the supplier commitments, the certification chains, the export approvals, the foreign government sign-offs. Etherline built avionics and guidance subsystems for Allied defense programs. We didn't make the whole aircraft. We made the parts that made the aircraft legal to fly, legal to sell, and legal to hand across a border. And the single largest of those programs, a 14-year joint initiative with 2 allied governments, was worth $1.4 billion over its lifetime. That program had my fingerprints on every page. Not metaphorically, literally. I'll get to that. Etherline had been acquired 4 months earlier by a private holding group, and with the acquisition came a new chief executive named Anton Marchetti. He was 41, sharp-suited, and had built his reputation unlocking value, a phrase he used the way some men use cologne, liberally and without noticing how it landed on the people around him. He came from consumer software. He had never worked a day inside a regulated industry, and he treated that inexperience not as a gap, but as an advantage. Fresh eyes, he called it, in the first all hands. We're going to move faster than this industry has ever seen a company move. I remember sitting in the back of that town hall, in the tiered auditorium on the ground floor, watching him pace the stage in front of a slide that read, Velocity, in white letters on a black field. Around me, engineers who had spent their entire careers learning why aerospace moves slowly, why every signature, every certification, every redundant check exists, sat very still. You don't survive in defense contracting by moving fast. You survive by moving correctly. The paperwork isn't friction. The paperwork is the product. Marchetti didn't know that yet. He would. My first real encounter with him came 3 weeks into his tenure. He'd requested a portfolio deep dive with each function head, and when my turn came, I brought a single-page summary and a thick binder I set on the table but didn't open. He glanced at the binder the way you'd glance at a fax machine. Program integration, he said, reading my title off his tablet like it was a foreign phrase. Walk me through what you actually do. In plain terms, pretend I'm a shareholder. So I did. I told him that the $1.4 billion Allied program ran on a certification architecture, a stack of interlocking approvals from our 2 partner governments, our domestic export authority, and a set of airworthiness bodies. I told him that these approvals weren't held by the company as an abstract entity. Regulators don't sign contracts with logos. They sign with named, accountable individuals. A single qualified person of record has to hold the airworthiness authority and the export control custodianship, and that person's identity is written into the license chain itself. And that person is? He asked, already looking at something else on his screen. Me, I said. He nodded without absorbing it. Great. Sounds like a process we can streamline. And he made a note. I could see the shape of the note from across the table, the way you can sometimes read the intent behind a gesture. It said, in effect, redundant. I want to be honest about something. I didn't build that arrangement as a trap. When the Allied program was first structured 14 years ago, the partner governments required a single continuous person of record, someone whose qualifications they had personally vetted, whose name would anchor the entire export license chain, and whose removal would require a formal revetting of the successor before any transfer of authority could take effect. It was a safeguard against exactly the kind of chaos that a corporate reshuffle creates. I was the one who qualified. I sat through the security clearances, the 2 foreign ministry interviews, the airworthiness board examinations. For 14 years, I renewed it quietly, every cycle, because it was my job and because I understood what it protected. Nobody at Etherline ever thought about it. That was the point. When a safeguard works, it's invisible. It just sits there, load-bearing, holding up a structure nobody looks at until someone tries to remove it. The second encounter was smaller and worse. It was a Thursday, late, and I'd stayed to close out a supplier certification issue on a subsystem that fed the Allied program. Marchetti passed my office on his way out. He paused in the doorway, tie loosened, jacket over his shoulder. "You're still here," he said. Not a question. "You know, Ingrid, I've been looking at the org chart. 17 years in one seat." He said it gently, almost admiringly, the way you'd compliment a piece of furniture that had been in the family a long time. That's a lot of institutional weight. Sometimes weight is just weight. I looked up from the certification packet. "In this industry, weight is usually load," I said. "The heavy things are holding something up." He smiled. He didn't get it. "We'll talk soon," he said, and left. We didn't talk soon. 2 weeks later, on that Tuesday, the coordinator walked past me with my nameplate in a box, and the memo hit my inbox at 9:41 a.m. Program leadership transition, effective immediately, signed by Anton Marchetti, CC'd to a distribution list of 43 people, none of whom were me. My access badge had already stopped working. I found that out when I tried to get back onto the executive floor to collect the rest of my things, and the reader blinked red at me, twice, patient and final. I stood in that hallway with a dead badge in my hand, and I felt the strangest thing. Not panic, not even anger, not yet. What I felt was the quiet, vertiginous clarity of someone watching a person saw enthusiastically at the branch they're sitting on, because Anton Marchetti had just terminated the only named person of record on a $1.4 billion export license chain. And the certification didn't transfer with the org chart. It didn't transfer at all. The moment my name came off the payroll, it came off the license, and every approval hanging from it began, silently, to come loose. He'd fired me by memo. He'd never once opened the binder. The reorganization was announced on a Wednesday in a fourth quarter strategy session held in the largest conference room on the 44th floor, the one everyone called the aquarium, because 3 of its walls were glass and you could watch the entire executive floor watch you. Marchetti had scheduled it for 10:41 in the morning, which struck me as oddly precise until I realized he'd wanted the natural light at its best for the cameras. He'd hired a production crew to record segments of the meeting for an internal vision reel. Nothing at Etherline had ever been recorded before. In defense contracting, you learn to be careful about what gets committed to a permanent record. He didn't know that yet either. I sat where I always sat, third seat on the left, my binder closed in front of me. Around the table were the function heads I'd worked beside for the better part of 2 decades. The head of supply chain, the engineering director, the 2 program managers who reported into my integration group, the general counsel, and a scattering of the new holding group people Marchetti had brought with him, all of them young, all of them fluent in a vocabulary of synergies and value unlocks that meant nothing on a factory floor. Marchetti stood at the head of the room with a clicker in his hand. Behind him, a slide read, Program 2.0, a leaner future. We've been carrying a lot of legacy structure, he began. Roles that made sense 15 years ago and don't make sense now. Program integration is the clearest example. He clicked. My function appeared on the screen as a box. And then, with a small animated flourish he must have thought was clever, the box dissolved into pixels. We're going to distribute integration across the individual program teams. Flatten it. Speed it up. No more bottleneck. A bottleneck. 17 years of holding the certification architecture together, and he called it a bottleneck, on camera, with a little animation of my job turning to dust. Ingrid, he said, turning to me with the warm, performative sympathy of a man who has practiced looking kind. You've given this company a lot. I want to acknowledge that. But program leadership needs a fresh face. We're going to be parting ways, effective at the end of this session. HR has your package. There it was. Not a conversation, not a private meeting. A firing staged as a keynote, timed for the light, captured on video. The room did the thing rooms do. A couple of the holding group people nodded, as if this were obviously correct. One of the young analysts, a man I'd never spoken to, who had been at the company perhaps 6 weeks, actually let out a small, nervous laugh, the kind that escapes when someone doesn't know how to hold a silence. The engineering director, a man I'd trusted for a decade, looked down at the table and studied the grain of the wood as though it might offer him an exit. Nobody spoke for me. That's the part people never believe until they've lived it. In the moment of your public unmaking, the people who owe you the most become the most interested in their own hands. I want to tell you exactly what I felt, because the truth is stranger than anger. I felt clarity. It arrived the way cold water arrives, all at once, everywhere, sharpening everything. I looked at Marchetti's slide, at the pixelated remains of my job, and I understood that he had just done something on camera that no attorney in the building would have let him do if any of them had understood what I understood. Because distributing integration across the program teams wasn't a reorganization of duties. On paper, in the eyes of 2 foreign governments and a domestic export authority, program integration wasn't a duty. It was a named person. And that person was me. I understand, I said. My voice was even. I'd decided, somewhere in the last 90 seconds, that I would give him nothing to edit into a villain reel. No outburst, no plea, no trembling dignity for the cameras to feast on. I'll make sure the handover is clean. Marchetti smiled, relieved. He'd expected resistance and gotten grace, and men like him always mistake grace for surrender. I appreciate that, Ingrid, really. That's the kind of professionalism this company was built on. It is, I agreed. The general counsel, a careful woman named Petra Holst, who had joined a year before the acquisition, glanced at me across the table. Just for a second. She was the only person in that room who looked like a question had occurred to her. I gave her nothing back. It wasn't time yet. After the session, I went back to my office to collect the few personal things they hadn't already boxed. My badge had gone dark, but the door was still propped open by the coordinator who'd been packing my shelves. On my desk, Someone had left the HR package in a crisp folder with the holding group's logo embossed on the front. Severance, an NDA, a non-disparagement clause, the usual architecture of a quiet exit. I read it standing up. It was generous, actually. They'd calculated a number designed to make me disappear gratefully. What the package did not contain, what no one in that building had thought to check, was any mention of the export license custodianship, the airworthiness authority, or the foreign ministry revetting requirement that governed the transfer of my role. Because those things didn't live in HR's system. They lived in a set of binders and a set of foreign government records, and in 14 years of quiet renewal, and in a single line on a license chain that read, in effect, Authorized Person of Record, Halloran I. That afternoon, before I left, I did exactly one thing that wasn't packing. I opened my work laptop while it still had 90 minutes of access left, and I found the Master Certification Index for the Allied program, the document that mapped every dependent approval back to its anchoring authority. I didn't alter it. I didn't delete anything. Altering it would have been a crime, and more importantly, it would have been unnecessary. The document was already a loaded weapon. All I had to do was make sure the right person would eventually read it. I forwarded a single page, the index page, the one that showed my name at the root of the whole export license tree, to Petra Holst in legal, with no message in the body, just the page. A person who understood what she was looking at would understand it instantly. A person who didn't would file it and forget it. Then I closed the laptop, set my badge on the desk beside the HR folder, and walked out through the glass corridor where, 6 hours earlier, my job had been turned into an animation. I didn't look back at the aquarium. I didn't need to. I already knew what the walls were made of. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, I understood that Anton Marchetti had, in a single morning, on video, in front of 40 witnesses, severed the one thread the entire $1.4 billion program hung from E, and thanked me for my professionalism while he did it. He had until roughly Thursday before the first agency noticed the thread was cut. Let me stop right here, because what happens next is the part I still can't quite believe unfolded the way it did. So tell me something first. Have you ever sat in a room and watched someone dismantle your work in front of a crowd while everyone you trusted suddenly found the floor fascinating? I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments below. One sentence or the whole story. I read everyone. And if you've ever been the quiet person someone mistook for a small one, subscribe and stay with me. Because the moment the first agency letter landed on Anton Marchetti's desk, that camera-ready smile of his did something I'll never forget. The first sign that something had gone wrong reached me not through a phone call, but through the silence of one that didn't come. I'd expected the severance paperwork to be processed within a day or two. A clean, efficient goodbye, the kind holding groups are good at. But by Friday afternoon, 3 days after Marchetti dissolved my job on camera, my HR portal still showed my status as pending. Not terminated, not active, pending. As though the system itself couldn't decide whether I still existed. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside my laptop and understood, with the particular calm that comes from having predicted a thing exactly, that the pending status wasn't a delay. It was the sound of a machine reaching a part it couldn't move. Let me explain what Anton Marchetti didn't know, because it's the entire architecture of what happened next. 14 years earlier, when Etherline first won the Allied Defense Program, the two partner governments imposed a condition that most people at the company had long since forgotten existed. A program of that sensitivity, avionics and guidance subsystems crossing international borders under export license, could not simply belong to a corporation. Corporations change hands. Boards turn over. Executives come and go. What the partner governments required was a human being, a single, continuously vetted, personally accountable individual to serve as the named airworthiness authority and export control custodian for the entire program. That person's identity was written directly into the license chain. Every downstream approval, the domestic export authorization, the 2 foreign ministry sign-offs, the airworthiness certifications on 11 separate subsystems hung from that one name like ornaments from a single hook. The name was mine. I hadn't schemed for it. When the program launched, I was the only integration lead who held the necessary clearances and could pass the foreign ministry vetting, so the role fell to me by default. And then, for 14 years, I did the invisible work of keeping it alive. Every renewal cycle, every 2 years, I sat through the revetting. I answered the questionnaires. I flew to 2 capitals and sat across from ministry officials who asked me the same careful questions each time. I maintained the continuity that the entire license depended on. Nobody at Etherline ever noticed, because a safeguard that works makes no noise. It just holds. And here was the mechanism Marchetti had walked straight into, blind. The license chain did not automatically transfer to a successor when the custodian left. It couldn't. The whole point of the safeguard was to prevent a corporation from swapping out its accountable human on a whim. When the named custodian was removed, the authority didn't pass to the next person in the org chart. It lapsed, and re-establishing it required the successor to complete a full revetting cycle with both partner governments before a single subsystem could be certified, shipped, or invoiced under the program. That revetting took, on average, between 9 and 11 months. Marchetti had fired me on a Tuesday. By Friday, the machine was pending. And somewhere in a compliance office 2 time zones away, an automated cross-check was about to run its scheduled sweep of the program's active certifications against the license chain's named authority, and find that the name had come off the payroll. The page I'd forwarded to Petra Holst in Legal, the Master Certification Index, showing my name at the root of the entire tree, was the map to all of this. I hadn't explained it. I hadn't needed to. A good general counsel who looked at that page long enough would eventually trace every branch back to the root and understand that the root had just been cut. Petra called me at 4:52 on Friday afternoon. Ingrid. Her voice was very controlled, the way a voice gets when the person behind it has been controlling it for a while. I've been looking at the document you sent me. I thought you might, I said. A pause. I could hear an office behind her, not the open hum of a normal workday, but something tighter, more urgent. Somewhere in that sound, I imagined, was the beginning of the thing I'd been waiting for. I need to ask you a direct question, she said. The Allied Program certifications, the Airworthiness Authority. Is it? She stopped, chose her words. Is the named custodian a role? Or is it a person? It's a person, I said. It has always been a person. That was the whole condition of the program. And that person is you. It was me. Until Tuesday at 9:41 a.m. when a memo went out over Anton Marchetti's signature ending my employment. I let that sit. The authority doesn't come with the org chart, Petra. It came with me, and it left with me. The silence on the line had a texture to it now. I'd worked with enough lawyers to know the exact moment when one of them stops hoping they've misread a document and accepts that they've read it perfectly. How long? She asked quietly. To re-establish it with a new custodian? 9 to 11 months. Assuming both partner governments cooperate on the timeline, which they're under no obligation to do. And during that window, nothing on the program can be certified, exported, or invoiced. Not one subsystem. The deliveries scheduled for this quarter can't legally leave the building. I heard her exhale. A long, slow breath, the sound of a professional recalculating the size of a problem. "There's a delivery milestone on the 14th, she said, half to herself. "The invoice tied to it is, she didn't finish. She didn't have to. I knew the figure as well as she was about to. The milestone payment on the 14th and the string of deliveries chained behind it across the rest of the program added up to the full lifetime value of the contract. $1.4 billion. And every dollar of it now sat behind a locked certification that only a revetting cycle or the original custodian could open. "Petra," I said, not unkindly, "you should pull the delivery schedule and the license chain and put them side by side before Monday. Because on Monday, someone in a compliance office is going to run a routine cross-check, and they're going to flag the program. And when they do, this stops being a question you can answer quietly." "Does Anton know?" she asked. I thought about the man on the stage with his clicker, dissolving my job into pixels, thanking me for my professionalism. The man who'd called 17 years of load-bearing work a bottleneck. The man who never once opened the binder. "No," I said. "He doesn't know yet. He fired the map and kept the territory, and he has no idea the territory only worked because of the map." There was a long pause. "I have to escalate this," Petra said. "Yes," I agreed. "You do." After she hung up, I sat for a while in the quiet of my kitchen, the tea fully cold now, the late light coming sideways through the window. I wasn't triumphant. That surprised me a little. What I felt was closer to the stillness of watching a stone you dropped days ago finally reach the bottom of a very deep well, the long wait, and then the small, definite sound of arrival. Monday was coming. The cross-check would run, and Anton Marchetti was about to learn that the bottleneck he'd removed had been the only thing holding back 9 months of silence. They held the meeting on a Thursday in the aquarium at 2:14 in the afternoon. I know the time because Petra Holst told me later, and because by then I'd started keeping my own record of the collapse, not out of vengeance, but out of the same instinct that had made me good at my job for 17 years. When something important happens, you write down when. I wasn't invited to that meeting. I found out what happened in it the way I found out about most things now, through a phone call from someone inside the building who suddenly remembered my number. The compliance cross-check had run on Monday, exactly as I'd told Petra it would. By Tuesday, it had escalated from a flag to a formal notice. By Wednesday, the Domestic Export Authority had issued a suspension letter on the Allied program, pending the re-establishment of a qualified named custodian. And on Thursday, the 2 partner government liaison offices, the ones I'd flown to see every 2 years for 14 years, sent a joint communication that landed on Anton Marchetti's desk like a dropped anvil. Petra read me the key line over the phone that evening. She didn't have to. I think she wanted a witness who would understand what it meant. The communication stated that the program's airworthiness authority had lapsed with the departure of the named custodian, that no transfer of authority was recognized, and that revetting of any successor would take a minimum of 9 months and could not be expedited. Until then, no subsystem under the program could be certified, exported, or invoiced. The delivery milestone scheduled for the 14th the one whose payment anchored the entire quarter, was legally frozen. $1.4 billion, the full lifetime value of the program, sitting behind a door that Anton Marchetti had locked himself, with a memo he'd signed at 9:41 on a Tuesday morning. I can reconstruct the meeting from 3 separate accounts, and they all agree on the shape of it. Marchetti came in still believing it was a paperwork problem. That was the phrase he'd used all week, apparently. A paperwork problem. Get it sorted. He'd assumed, The way men like him always assume that any obstacle made of documents could be dissolved by someone else's labor if he applied enough impatience. He walked into the aquarium expecting to be told the sorting was nearly done. Instead, Petra laid the certification index on the glass table. My index. The one whose route page I'd forwarded to her the afternoon I was fired. She'd spent the intervening days doing what no one else in that building had ever bothered to do. She'd traced every branch back to the route, and she'd confirmed what the route said. The airworthiness authority for the Allied program was never held by the company, she told the room. It was held by a named individual, Ingrid Halloran. When her employment was terminated, the authority lapsed. It does not transfer. There is no successor on record, and establishing one takes 9 months minimum per both partner governments. During that window, we cannot certify, ship, or invoice anything on the program. Someone asked. I'm told it was one of the holding group people, the young man who'd laughed nervously the day I was fired, whether they could simply appoint a new custodian internally and backdate it. Petra said no. She said it slowly, so it would land. Backdating a foreign government airworthiness authorization was not an administrative shortcut. It was a fraud that would end the company's eligibility for defense work entirely and possibly end several careers in a federal courtroom. That, apparently, was the moment the room understood. Marchetti didn't understand it all at once. He fought it the way drowning men fight water. He said there had to be a workaround. He said no single employee could possibly be that critical. That was exactly the kind of legacy bottleneck he'd been brought in to eliminate. He said, and this is the line 3 people quoted to me identically, "Nobody is that important. This is a company, not a monarchy." Petra told him evenly that it wasn't about importance. It was about a signature. 2 foreign governments had, 14 years ago, agreed to trust one vetted human being, and that human being's name was the only one they recognized. He had not eliminated a bottleneck. He had removed a load-bearing wall and was now standing in the room watching the ceiling come down, insisting that walls don't work that way. Then he asked the question that everything had been moving toward. He asked if I could be brought back to fix it. I want to be precise about my own state of mind here, because it matters. When my phone rang that Friday morning and I saw it was Petra, I already knew what she was going to ask. I'd known since the memo hit my inbox. I'd had the entire week to decide who I wanted to be in this conversation, and I'd decided I would not be cruel, and I would not be small, and I would not pretend I hadn't seen exactly this coming. "Ingrid," Petra said, "I'm going to be direct because you've earned directness. The program is frozen. You're the only recognized custodian. We need to understand what it would take to resolve this." "I understand the situation," I said. "Better than anyone in that building, I'd imagine." "Anton would like to speak with you." "I'm sure he would." There was a pause, and then Petra did something that told me a great deal about her. She lowered her voice and said, off the record, that she'd read the index the day I sent it, and that she'd understood within an hour what it meant, and that she'd spent the week deciding whether to warn Marchetti early or let it play out. She said she'd chosen to simply present the facts when asked, cleanly, without protecting anyone from them. "I don't work for him," she said. "I work for the company, and the company was about to commit fraud to cover a mistake he refused to see." They put Marchetti on the line an hour later. He'd rehearsed. I could hear it. The tone was warm, collegial, the voice of a man pretending the last 2 weeks hadn't happened. "Ingrid, I think there's been a real misunderstanding here. We value you enormously. I don't think that came through clearly enough. Let's find a path forward. Whatever it takes to get you re-engaged, we're open." "Anton," I said, "you called 17 years of my work a bottleneck, on camera, and then you dissolved it into pixels for a vision reel. Silence. "I'm not saying that to wound you," I went on. "I'm saying it because you need to understand something before we talk numbers. You didn't fire an employee. You severed the only human authority two foreign governments were willing to trust on a 14-year program. That authority left with me because it was always attached to me. Not to the seat, not to the org chart, not to the company. To me. You spent your whole tenure certain that the people around you were interchangeable. And you just proved, at a cost of $1.4 billion, that at least one of them wasn't." I heard him breathe. When he spoke again, the warmth was gone and something rawer had come up underneath it. "What do you want?" he said. Not a question. A capitulation dressed as one. "I'll tell you what I'm willing to do," I said. "And then you can decide whether you're still the man who gives orders in that building, or whether that's someone else's job now." The board met on the last Monday of the month at 11:08 in the morning in the aquarium, the same glass room where Anton Marchetti had turned my 17 years into an animation. I know the time because I was in the room this time, seated on the far side of the table, and I watched the second-hand move on the wall clock while the directors filed in. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because it would be easy to make it sound like triumph, and it wasn't exactly. It was more like watching a tide go out and reveal what had always been under the water. I came back, but not the way Marchetti wanted. In the phone call, I'd told him my terms, and my terms were not a rate. I didn't want to be a consultant paid 4 times my old salary to quietly unlock the program and let him keep his chair. I'd watched enough men keep their chairs after being handed the very rope that should have hanged their careers. I told him I would re-engage as the named custodian only under a governance structure that put the program and the authority that anchored it permanently beyond the reach of a single executive's whim. In practice, that meant a seat, a real one with a vote, on the committee that oversaw the Allied program. And it meant that the re-vetting of my authority would be conducted openly in front of the board so that every director understood exactly what had almost been lost and why. The holding group agreed within a day. They didn't agree because they liked me. They agreed because a 9-month freeze on a $1.4 billion program disclosed to their own investors would have been the kind of event that ends not one career, but several. Faced with that, my terms were cheap. That is the quiet arithmetic of leverage. It isn't about what you want. It's about what the other side can no longer afford to refuse. Marchetti was in the room that Monday. He had to be. The board wanted to hear him account for the decision. He looked smaller than he had on his Velocity stage. Not physically, but in the way a man looks smaller when the crowd he performed for has stopped watching him and started watching the thing he broke. Petra Holst presented first. She laid out the timeline without ornament. The termination memo at 9:41 on a Tuesday, the lapse of the Airworthiness Authority, the compliance flag, the suspension letter, the joint communication from the 2 partner governments. She did not editorialize. She didn't need to. The facts walked across the table in single file, and every director followed them to the same place. Then the chair of the board, a measured woman named Ingrid Holloway, no relation to Petra, who had sat on this board longer than Marchetti had been in the industry, turned to him and asked him to explain, in his own words, the business rationale for eliminating program integration. He tried. I'll give him that. He talked about flattening structure, about legacy weight, about velocity. But the words that had sounded like vision on a stage sounded, in that room, like a man describing the reasoning behind removing a support beam because it was inconveniently load-bearing. Halfway through, he seemed to hear it himself. He slowed. He stopped. "I didn't know the authority was attached to a person," he said finally. "No," the chair agreed. "You didn't ask." That was the whole of it, really. 4 months of certainty, a $1.4 billion program brought to the edge of a 9-month silence, and it came down to a question he never asked because he'd already decided the answer didn't matter. He'd walked into a regulated industry convinced that the slowness of it was a flaw to be corrected, and he'd corrected the one thing that was holding the fast parts together. The board did not fire him in the room. Boards rarely do. The theater of it is beneath them. But by the following week, a brief internal note announced that Anton Marchetti would be stepping back from operational leadership to pursue other opportunities, and a search for a new chief executive was underway. The holding group installed an interim leader who had, mercifully, spent a career in the industry and understood on site why a certification chain matters. One of his first acts was to meet with me, not to flatter, but to ask, in plain terms, what other invisible beams were holding up the house so that no one would ever again cut one by accident. I told him. It took most of an afternoon. He wrote it all down. Marchetti and I spoke once more, briefly, in the weeks after. It wasn't a dramatic scene, and I won't inflate it into one. I was leaving the executive floor after a committee session. He was clearing the last of his things from an office that was no longer his. The door was open. He looked up, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "You could have warned me," he said. Not angry, tired. I thought about it. "I could have," I said. "But you'd decided, months before, that people like me were the friction. A warning is a thing you give someone who might listen. You weren't listening. You were animating my job into dust for a vision reel." He didn't argue. He just nodded, slowly, and went back to his box. I didn't feel vindicated watching him. I felt the way you feel when a long-postponed correction finally arrives. Not glad exactly, just steadied. The way a room settles once a crooked picture is finally straightened. I stayed at Etherline. That surprised some people who expected me to found a rival or sell my leverage and vanish. But the program was mine in every way that mattered. I'd carried its authority for 14 years, flown to 2 capitals every renewal cycle, kept it alive in 100 rooms where no one noticed. Walking away from it to spite one man would have meant abandoning the thing itself to prove a point about him. The thing was worth more than the point. What changed was that the beam is visible now. My name is still at the root of the license chain, but it's no longer a secret hidden in a binder no executive would open. It's on the governance chart, in the board minutes, in the interim CEO's notes. The authority that Marchetti mistook for overhead is now understood by everyone who matters as the load it always was. A few weeks after all of it settled, I stayed late in my office, the corner one, on the 44th floor, the one with the view of the airfield I'd never bothered to watch. That evening I watched. A transport jet, one of ours, one carrying subsystems that were legal to fly and legal to cross a border because my name still sat quietly at the root of everything, lifted off the runway into a pale sky and climbed until I couldn't see it anymore. I'd spent 17 years being the reason things stayed off the front page, the reason no letter came, no license lapsed, no door stayed locked. That is the strange grief of invisible work. When you do it perfectly, it looks like nothing happened at all. Anton Marchetti's real mistake wasn't cruelty. It was believing that the absence of visible trouble meant there was no one holding the trouble back. He learned the cost of that belief. To the number, 1.4 billion of it. I turned off my desk lamp, and the city came up in the glass. And I understood something I'd known for a long time without ever saying it plainly. The people who hold the most weight are usually the quietest in the room, right up until the day someone tries to take the weight away and learns too late exactly what it was carrying.